In the first two parts of the Art of Geopolitics series, we began to look at what geopolitics is as a practice. We also introduced some analytical models such as the geopolitical web of power, which explores the interaction between geotechnology, geostrategy, and geoeconomics and how their interaction is used to create geopolitical power. We also explored the human dimension of geopolitics, the interaction of human beings, of human politics with land, terrain, and territory. So, in this part, we are going to use all our analytical models, put them together, and apply them to historical case study. We will look at this period, which is known as the period of the Great Game, which was a long conflict in the 18th century between two empires of Tsarist Russia and British India for control of Eurasia. So, when John Mearshimer he wrote his book, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, he used the term tragedy for a reason. The tragedy of great power politics is summed up by the phrase uncertainty of intentions. Now, this phrase is used because in the international system, an actor does not know what his opponent will do. So, one must assume that his opponent will do the worst. Therefore, every actor on the international stage must prepare for the worst from his opponent. Because, as Paul Kennedy reminds us, if your opponent succeeds, the rise of a great power, of a rival great power, is always coterminous with the fall of another or the fall of your power. So, if you want to persist in the international system, you have to prevent the rise of your opponent. So, this is going to be the key dynamic that we will see in the Great Game. The structure of this essay is largely going to be built around telling a narrative history of the rise of two rival empires, and we will look at the activation of the geopolitical web of power, the interaction between geotechnology, geostrategy, and geoeconomics, and the clash of perceptions due to uncertainty between these two empires. So, since we mentioned tragedy, let us begin with death. The death of Peter the Great, the first emperor of Russia. In January 1725, the winter in Russia was even gloomier than usual. The empire was in mourning for its first emperor, who was on his deathbed. Peter had been the sole Tsar of Russia since 1696. For a few years before that, he had ruled jointly with his stepbrother. In 1721, he had become Russia's first emperor. And the Russia that Peter had inherited had been a kingdom set in the middle of the West Eurasian plain. Since the era of the Scythians, numerous kingdoms have risen and fallen and have become quaint artifacts of history in this West Eurasian plain. Think of the Huns, the Cumans, the Avars, the Khazars, and even the Grand Lithuanian Empire. Now, Russia could have easily become one of these instead of the behemoth that it is. Of course, there were earlier great Tsars, but if you know something of Peter, you would know he was known as a reformer. He was an institution builder. I'm not going to talk about his cultural reformation, which was equally important, but in terms of the web of geopolitical power, from 1698, that year is important, we will return to that in a moment, Peter focused on streamlining and organizing scattered Russian industries, geoeconomics and geotechnology interface, as Russia was plunged into war. So he integrated and streamlined these industries for war production, making cannon foundries, powder mills, musket factories, leather works, textile mills, and also mining operations. And in fact, in Peter's lifetime, Russia's pig iron production, which is a measure of industrialization in that era, had equaled that of Sweden and also of England, which was the greatest producer of pig iron before Russia. So it was in war with Sweden that Russia, in fact, emerged as a great power, and all these institutions that Peter had built came into their own. So in the 17th century, it was Sweden which one would have expected to become a great European power. Sweden wasn't just restricted to a peninsula on the Scandinavian peninsula. It in fact had a lot of territories also in Northern Europe. So Sweden had a powerful army and a powerful navy. It was able to conduct an integrated land and sea operations across this North European theater. The Swedish army in fact was so strong that it was regularly knocking out opponents, even if they had a 3-1 advantage. So, the history of the Great Northern War, which raged on for 21 years, is complex, but broadly speaking, there were two alliances pitted against each other. For most of the war, Russia, along with Denmark and some smaller allies, was fighting against Sweden, who was supported on and off in a minor way by the Ottoman Empire and in the later stages of the war also by England. So Russia's goal initially was to gain access to the Baltic, so Peter would have a porthead to access the oceans of the world, while Sweden, led by the warrior King Charles, wanted to consolidate his North European territories and perhaps extend them into the heartland of Europe. So Peter quickly gained territories in the region that was his initial goal. Initial war aims were realized, and even before the war was over, he began to build his dream city of St. Petersburg in conquered territories. But remember, the war was still raging. So Charles knocked out a few opponents in northern Europe and then moved towards Russia. And there he dealt a severe blow to Russia's army, almost annihilating the entire army that was operating in the region. And here, St. Petersburg and everything Peter had dreamt of could have been destroyed if Charles had moved against it. So just having that vision was not enough, but Peter, as we mentioned before, had also done his homework. Despite his army being knocked out, the institutional reforms that he had set into motion before had been geared towards producing a war machine, and that war machine quickly kicked in, which allowed him to recover and build a new army. So even as the war went on, this war machine came into its own. Peter had created so many positive feedback loops in his geopolitical web of power, supporting his industry, that after 21 years he defeated Sweden and became Russia's first emperor. Now, where had Peter gained the inspiration for these reforms? Most of it was because of his own unique nature, but just after becoming sole Tsar, he had in fact gone on a grand tour of the West, which had also taken him to England, where he had met his idol William of Orange. So in January 1698, a young Peter who had been traveling incognito around Europe was approaching London by sea, and he saw a sight that enamored him. Now, Peter was enamored by the ships. What he saw before him was a sight to behold, a forest of masts of hundreds of ships. It was said, in fact, that on any given day, 2,000 ships at least were docked at London, and this was just a fraction of the merchant fleet that also sailed the waters of the earth. So in 1698, 10 years or so after the Glorious Revolution, in which William had deposed the previous King of England, James, England had been transformed from a medieval island kingdom into a global mercantile power. Peter saw this in the dockyards, he saw this in the reforms that were carried out in the monetary system by none other than Isaac Newton and also by John Locke. He saw it in the factories, he saw it in the warehouses, and of course, he saw it in the dockyards. So this was in 1698, and remember I mentioned 1698 was an important date. Peter returned home and began implementing these new ideas he had seen, adapting them to Russia's needs. And when the time came in the North European War, he had that war machine ready. So, some of the ships Peter saw in London probably belonged to the East India Company. The EIC had been trading in India for almost 100 years, but for most of its history, it was a fledgling company, and even individual merchants in India had more ships than the EIC, not to mention the Dutch and other European powers. But things were about to change. Remember, in the beginning of the 18th century, the sea power of England was beginning to rise, especially because of the reforms of William. The land power of Russia was also rising. But there was a geopolitical opportunity at the southern end of the Eurasian rimland. Now, you see in this map, by 1700, the Emperor Aurangzeb had built a vast pan-South Asian empire. But he died in 1707. And even while he had extended his empire to its furthest extent, it had come at a cost. Overextension, right? In his final years, he had been campaigning to put down rebellions all across India, an uprising of the Marathas of central India, and even as he died and his successor was barely secure on the throne, a rebellion by the Sikhs broke out in the Punjab in the north. So the north and the west of the empire was in flames when Aurangzeb died, and it took 2 decades after him and 3 successive emperors to put down various rebellions in various parts of the region, even as the Marathas had seceded and consolidated their own empire. There was disorder everywhere, and a death blow was struck by Nadir Shah, the emperor of Persia, who invaded and occupied Delhi. So this allowed other vassals of the Mughal Empire to break free, and some European companies who were trading in India were also, in a sense, vassals of the Mughal Empire because they had trading contracts, and this also gave them an opportunity. The East India Company had, in fact, tried its luck even a few years before Aurangzeb had died. So Aurangzeb died in 1707. In 1690, the East India Company had tried to push against Aurangzeb for more territories on the coast, and had indulged in a brief war called Child's War, in which the East India Company had been trounced by Aurangzeb. And this gave a lot of lessons to the English in 1690, that they also needed land power in addition to the sea power that they had if they were to secure their hold in the Indian subcontinent whenever the opportunity came. So this was in 1690, of course. In 1707, when Aurangzeb died, by then the East India Company had learned their lessons, and through bribery and diplomacy over the next few decades, since 1690, they had maneuvered themselves into positions that would make Sun Tzu and Machiavelli proud. So, after Aurangzeb died and the Mughal Empire began to collapse, the East India Company had its alliances in place. It had its land army and it also had its sea power, and it won a series of wars. First against the French and their rivals in South India, known as the Carnatic Wars, and then in 1757 they conquered Bengal in the Battle of Plassey. So 1757 is an important year. The EIC, through intrigue and combined land and sea operations, managed to install a puppet ruler in the province of Bengal. So they'd also used some local allies and networked connections, especially with banking houses and merchants. In the defining Battle of Plassey, the EIC, working with two merchant houses of Bengal, got a commander leading a bulk of the opponent forces to switch sides and then installed them as a puppet Nawab. So the Bengal gave the East India Company both a bridgehead and a winning strategy. In the next 4 decades, using their twin doctrines of land power and sea power, and also using diplomacy and intrigue, by quickly deploying locally raised armies across theatres in western and eastern India, they managed to steamroll local land powers. They had learned these lessons over the previous 5 decades, especially in Child's War and later wars. They managed to steamroll local powers across all the theatres of India, and using not just geostrategy but also ruthless geoeconomics. Every territory that the East India Company captured was sucked dry of resources to raise new local armies. So remember that geoeconomics and geostrategy nexus is not always benign. So, by the beginning of the 19th century, the EIC had defeated all of its major Indian rivals, especially the Marathas, and the only Indian territories which remained were north of Delhi, the dominions of the Sikhs, who had once been disunited but were being consolidated into an empire of their own by the great Emperor Maharaja Ranjit Singh, also known as the Lion of Punjab. After 40 years of relentless conquest, for 50 years the East India Company's northern borders would remain fixed at a mutually decided boundary between the Empire of Punjab and the East India Company. Now the board had been set, and a second round of the great game was about to begin. So, what was going on in Russia at this point of time? Let us take a look at that. In the decades after Peter's death, he was succeeded by some minor czars, interspersed between 3 great Tsaristas: his wife Catherine I, his daughter Elizabeth, and finally Catherine the Great. These strong empresses had built on his legacy. Catherine the Great had extended Russian rule permanently into the Caucasus by annexing territories from Persia, which had been fought for on and off since Peter's last days, and also claimed some territories from the Ottoman Empire and extended Russia's rule into Central Asia. So Russia's great land army was almost unstoppable in these Eurasian theatres. Catherine had in fact had claimed, "I shall not die until I have ejected the Turks from Europe, suppressed the pride of China, and established trade with India." So those were her goals. She ended up doing a lot but didn't achieve all of those goals. Now, even as the grand chessboard of geopolitics was being set up in Asia, especially in Eurasia, a major player who threatened to turn everything on its head was entering the stage in Europe. In the decade of the 1790s, Napoleon Bonaparte had begun to rise to power. After consolidating his rule in France, after his campaigns in Italy, he had crossed the pond of the Mediterranean and invaded Egypt. Napoleon, like most men who aim at being world conquerors, styled himself after Alexander the Great, and no one can seriously emulate Alexander unless you conquer India, ignoring for the moment the fact that Alexander just reached the borders of India. So that is a different story. So there was some indication that Napoleon's invasion of Egypt was a stepping stone towards an invasion of India, especially to strike at the British. He had maintained some diplomatic contact with the warrior king Tipu Sultan of Mysore. So if Napoleon did attack the British in India, he would have to strike out across the Arabian Sea. He would either have to build a fleet there, maybe transport his Mediterranean fleet over land to the Arabian Sea. But that option was taken out of the equation as the British naval campaign led by Horatio Nelson destroyed Napoleon's Mediterranean fleet. So you see the importance of the entire Eurasian theater, especially with India as this geo-economic center where all these companies are trading, and everyone wants to destabilize Britain, which has this geo-economics, geostrategy nexus going in India, and then you have the land power of Eurasia, and you have hybrid land and sea operations planned by Napoleon, which ultimately failed. But Napoleon took another option. Napoleon struck an alliance with the Tsar of Russia, who was now Paul, and he made a secret alliance with Emperor Paul, and they planned to strike out at India overland through the heart of Eurasia. So this was the beginning of the classic Great Game, as it is called. Now things didn't work out from Napoleon's side. Napoleon was caught up in his own struggles in Europe, but in 1801, Paul sent out an army of 20,000 Cossacks to march through Central Asia through the Khanates of Khiva and Bukhara and strike at the British in India. Now, even Peter had in fact sent an expedition to Khiva too in 1716, and Peter's intention was to get to the river Amu Darya, map it, and fortify key locations. So initially, Peter's expedition of 1716 had been moderately successful. They had reached the river, they had begun to map it out, and they had constructed 2 forts on either side in strategic locations to allow for crossing the river. Peter was in fact adept at using rivers for internal transport in continental Eurasia. He had used rivers remarkably in the Crimean campaigns against the Ottoman Empire, used them to supply his troops who marched alongside the rivers till the arrival of railways. Rivers were the highways of continental transport. But Peter's attempt had finally failed, and Paul's expedition with no knowledge of the terrain, also remember Peter's army had been annihilated, and Paul's army was being sent with no knowledge of the terrain, no way to supply the army or send backup resources. It was foolish to begin with. But he died. He died before the army set off, before the army was far from Russia's borders and the army was summoned back. And thankfully, a lot of lives were saved. So, of course, even though the British had managed to secure their hold over the Indian subcontinent, except, of course, the northern territories where the Sikh Empire was a strong, powerful neighbor, there had been 2 threats, which took the principle of uncertainty that Mearshimer mentioned to a red alert. So, of course, the principle of uncertainty means that the British didn't know which enemy would strike out against them and from where that enemy would strike out against them. So, in 1808, the Governor General of British India sent 3 embassies. One to the Kingdom of Punjab, the immediate northern neighbor, which was, of course, the empire of the Sikhs. The second to Persia, a more distant neighbor, which occupied a key position on the bridgeland of Eurasia, remember from where Napoleon was planning to strike out. And the third to a more mysterious Kingdom of Kabul, which was the Afghan empire of Ahmad Shah Durrani, which had once extended from the Amu Darya to Delhi, and now centered around the twin cities of Kabul and Peshawar, on both sides of the Khyber Pass. So the summer and winter capital of the kingdom respectively. So over the next decades, this Kingdom of Kabul, as it came to be known, or Afghanistan, became a key theater in the Great Game, especially because it was constantly contested by Persia in the west and by the Sikh Empire in the east and by the other Khanates of Central Asia and the north. So in the decades that followed this embassy, the Sikh Empire gobbled up huge chunks of what remained of the Indian territories of the Durrani Empire. This included the region of Kashmir and more importantly the Peshawar Valley. Now the loss of the Peshawar Valley hurt the Afghans, because Peshawar, the city, was not only the summer capital of the empire, the valley of Peshawar around the city was geographically rich. And this was also the original homeland of the Afghans. So, the Afghan king Dost Muhammad, after failing to retake Peshawar many times, offered an alliance to the British. He proposed, if they could help him recover Peshawar, he would become a permanent ally of the British. But the British refused. So there were other geopolitical calculations in mind. Remember, they were creating an architecture of control. And the Sikhs, of course, were a more powerful state and an immediate northern neighbor. Now, just to the south of the Sikh Empire, there were smaller Sikh principalities or Sikh kingdoms, which were part of the British Indian territories. So there were these larger calculations within play. But also because the Sikhs were a more powerful state. And remember, they had defeated the Afghans in many wars. Perhaps they could be relied upon more in case the Russians or the French invaded. So the game was in play. And also at that time, there was an ex Afghan king wandering around in India. His name was Shah Shuja. Now, Shah Shuja had been a king of Afghanistan when the first British embassy had reached him in 1808. So, this is happening a few decades after 1808. In the meantime, the Afghan Empire has lost lots of its territories. It has tried to regain them. Dost Muhammad has made an offer. The British have refused, and they are playing this counter move in the Great Game. So, Shah Shuja had been deposed a year after 1808 when the first British embassy had reached. Now, in the meantime, in these 20 years, Shah Shuja had been pleading with the British to help him to recover his throne. The British, of course, were keen on maintaining peace at their frontier. But when miffed at the refusal of the British Indian state to help him recover Peshawar, Dost Muhammad turned to the Russians. Then the British decided to play their card. They decided to put this pawn on the board of the Great Game. They struck what was called a tripartite alliance. They struck an alliance with the Sikhs as one party, with Shah Shuja as the second party, and of course themselves as the third party to depose Dost Muhammad, who had dared, in a sense, to reach out to the Russians. So, Afghanistan was invaded by this tripartite alliance, and there was a contingent supporting Shah Shuja, there was a contingent of the Sikh army, and there was also a British contingent which remained back in Kabul after defeating Dost Muhammad to protect Shah Shuja. But only a few months after Shah Shuja had become a king, there was a new civil war, there was unrest. The king who was protected by the British garrison was again deposed, and in fact he was killed. And the entire British garrison was massacred, a lot of them in Kabul itself, and all that remained of them as they were trying to flee back to India was one last survivor. The buffer system was in tatters. The architecture of control had failed to build a wall on the frontier. But in 5 years, a new opportunity arose to rebuild that architecture of control. And this opportunity arose in the Punjab. The old king of the Punjab, Maharaja Ranjit Singh, had died. There was a new revolutionary fervor in the kingdom as the army of the Sikhs threatened to depose the ruling dynasty and set up a military republic. Now, the European experience of the French Revolution foretold what such a state led by an army, and especially a military republic, would portend in a theatre as sensitive as British India. So, at the slightest invitation from the regent Queen of Punjab, of course, who had an alliance with the British invaded to defeat the army, support the dynasty, and gradually they began to penetrate the apparatus of the state. So revolution and discontent raged on in Punjab for 5 years till another massive war broke out. This was the Second Anglo-Sikh War in 1850. The East India Company deployed almost all its regiments in this new theatre, using Punjab's rivers to supply troops. Remember that land-sea integration that the East India Company were masters at? They brought in a gunship up the Indus River to aid in the siege of the strong fortress of Multan in the southern territories of the Sikh Empire. Ultimately, the British outfought and, more importantly, outsupplied the Sikhs, showing the might of their war machine and the integration of geoeconomics and geostrategy and the way they were able to. So in 1850, Punjab was annexed. The frontier moved north. And in the meantime, Russia had begun to move south. In the next 2 decades, the Russian Empire annexed all the remaining khanates of Central Asia, and all that remained between the two empires was Afghanistan. Now let's turn to a little bit of theory. So we are at the 1870s. So in the 1870s, there was a new geotechnological dynamic at play in Russia's expansion into Central Asia, and this was railways. So by now, the famous Trans-Caspian Railway was becoming from an idea into a reality. There was also a geoeconomic logic behind the Russian expansion into Central Asia. In the 18th century, Russia's desire to expand into this region was motivated by the search of gold in its rivers. Now, the land of Central Asia became a prize. The vast fields of Central Asia were said to be the most conducive regions for growing cotton, which was a prized commodity in world trade. So here again you see geoeconomic calculations driving geostrategy and the importance of geotechnology in the railways. So Russian expansion into Central Asia promoted another British war with Afghanistan. By now, Britain too was backed by railways, and the vast manpower and strategic geographical positions in Punjab also came into play. The war was over before it even began. Afghanistan was forced to concede key strategic locations along the Hindu Kush Mountains. Railway lines were laid, fortified cantonment towns were built, and the architecture of control was fortified. Now, just to get an idea of the expansion of these two empires, so we think of Russia as having expanded its borders, but since the beginning of the 18th century, the British Empire in India had moved its borders almost 1,000 kilometers northwest. And after the Second Anglo-Afghan War, if you count Afghanistan as well, that is another 500 kilometers. So both these behemoths had expanded across this Eurasian heartland. And in fact, the expansion of the British Empire beginning from Bengal was just a few hundred kilometers short in terms of territory than the Russian Empire. In terms of population, of course, the British Empire was much larger. So the great game is coming towards an end as we move into the late stages. There were still some final rounds to go. So let us stop to ask here, what was this great game? You see these two empires beginning from their locations, one in the north of Eurasia and one in the south of Eurasian rimland, both expanding and controlling by the end of by this period, by the 1870s, by the 1880s, most of the key strategic areas, territories in this region. Of course, there was a sense of uncertainty, which we mentioned before, a fear of an enemy striking out from an unknown region on the map. So, geographers like to call this cartographic anxiety. So, you are in a sense motivated by the fear of unknown spaces, as they say. So, mapping out these regions, collecting intelligence about them, was a big part of this great game. And this was popularized by Rudyard Kipling in his novel Kim. But remember, in the end, a game is played between two players in what is technically called a ludic space, but we might call it a game world or a board or a grand chessboard of geopolitics, as it is called. But remember, players can enter this game world, play against each other, and exit when they want. In the end, while in the game world they are opponents, in the real world they're actually collaborating by playing along the rules of the game, and the only people who are sacrificed are the pawns in the game who are being played by these great players. So what's this happening in the great game? Now let us just look at the closing rounds. Now Russia was at British India's door. What had been prophesied for ages that Russia was a threat? But what happened when they became neighbors now, by the 1880s, 1890s? Russia and Britain agreed to send a joint commission to collaborate to create Afghanistan's borders, and they jointly agreed to close the game. There was one final scare as a British survey team was mapping Afghanistan's northern boundaries along with Russia near Merv, and a local Russian commander on his own initiative attacked an Afghan position in a place known as the Panjshir Oasis, and he slaughtered dozens of Afghans in their sleep. Now remember, at this time Afghanistan was supposed to be under British protection. There was an armed contingent with the British survey team in the region, and they obligated to defend the Afghans. But what did they do? They walked away. The incident was hushed up, and the Afghan king was forced to give up Panjshir to Russia. And not just Panjshir, the boundary was drawn, and many lands which had nominally belonged to the Afghans were either taken by the British or the Russians. So the game was closed by mutual agreement, and the pawns suffered. In the end, all that remained to separate these two great empires was Afghanistan, which at its narrowest was a 15-mile corridor known as the Wakhan Corridor, where Afghanistan also shares its borders with China, so that's become important now in the new great game, especially in light of the Belt and Road Initiative and the war in Afghanistan. So the two empires, returning to our story, the two empires called it a game and in the words of Lord Curzon, the frontier problem had finally been solved scientifically, and a scientific frontier had been made so that the two empires could now rule in peace for ages and ages to come, perhaps centuries to come. That was the vision, to build these new Roman empires. But that is not what happened, is it? A few years after the closing of the game, so to say, a series of border rebellions broke out, both on the British and the Russian side, and just a decade later, the First World War. By the end of the World War, Tsarist Russia had ceased to exist, and Britain was beginning to draw an exit plan from India. It was all but certain that they would have to leave within decades. Now, what is the lesson for the art of geopolitics here? I've mentioned various insights throughout the narrative about land power, sea power, the interactions between geostrategy, geoeconomics, and geotechnology. But no matter what doctrines are formed or what grand strategies are created, the most important lesson of geopolitics is to not ignore the politics in the geo. If a nation cannot ensure basic needs of politics, which is a sense of justice in who gets what, where, when, and how, no matter what edifice you build, it will be hollow from below. Russia's expansion to great power status came with a dark underbelly of millions of exploited serfs, of millions of sacrificed pawns in this great game. Britain's colonial exploitation had impoverished India to an unimaginable degree. If that is the game you play, history tells us, you're bound to lose.